Chris got slapped in the face at the Oscars by Will Smith, which was one of the craziest things I'd ever seen. In fact,
Public moments in Hollywood often hide deeper truths that only a few dare to speak about. Lately, something unexpected has come out involving Chris Rock and Dave Chappelle, and it is starting to change how people see Will Smith. What they revealed is not just another headline. It feels like a side of the story many never heard before. Fans and critics alike are paying close attention, trying to piece it all together. But what exactly did they expose that has everyone talking? Join us as we break down Chris Rock and Dave Chappelle exposing Will Smith, the slap that changed everything. As it happened, March 27, 2022, was like any other Academy Awards ceremony. Hollywood's biggest stars filled the Dolby Theatre in Los Angeles, dressed in designer gowns and custom tuxedos, ready to celebrate another year of movies. Chris Rock walked onto the stage to present the award for Best Documentary Feature. He looked out at the audience, saw Jada Pinkett Smith sitting near the front with her husband Will Smith, and decided to make a joke. Rock compared Jada's shaved head to Demi Moore's look in the 1997 film G.I. Jane, saying he couldn't wait to see G.I. Jane 2. The joke landed awkwardly. Jada rolled her eyes. Will laughed at first, then looked at his wife and saw she wasn't amused. Keep watching, because what Chris Rock and Dave Chappelle have been saying about Will Smith since that night reveals a truth about Hollywood that nobody wanted to admit. Will Smith stood up from his seat, walked calmly onto the stage, and slapped Chris Rock across the face in front of millions of viewers watching live around the world. Rock stumbled back slightly, stunned, and said, "Wow, Will Smith just smacked the shit out of me." Smith walked back to his seat and shouted twice for Rock to keep his wife's name out of his mouth, using language that had to be censored. The audience sat in shocked silence. People watching at home couldn't tell if it was staged or real. The ceremony continued, and less than an hour later, Will Smith won the Oscar for Best Actor for his role in King Richard. He gave an emotional acceptance speech, apologizing to the Academy and his fellow nominees, but not to Chris Rock. He talked about being a river to his people, about protecting his family, about love making you do crazy things. Chris Rock didn't press charges. He released a brief statement saying he was still processing what occurred, then mostly went silent for months. The world exploded with opinions. Some defended Will Smith, saying he was protecting his wife from a cruel joke about her medical condition. Jada Pinkett Smith has alopecia, an autoimmune disorder that causes hair loss. Others condemned Smith for resorting to violence on live television. The Academy banned Smith from attending the Oscars for 10 years. He resigned his membership. Major film studios quietly shelved projects. Smith's carefully crafted image as one of Hollywood's most likable stars shattered in 10 seconds. Dave Chappelle was watching from home that night. In his Netflix special The Dreamer, released on New Year's Eve 2023, Chappelle admitted he thought the slap was fake when it happened. Many viewers believed it was a scripted bit. Chappelle waited about 30 minutes, then called Rock on FaceTime. Rock answered immediately and told Chappelle, "You're the only person I'd answer the phone for right now." Obama, Oprah, and countless other celebrities had been calling. Chappelle asked the question everyone wanted answered. Did it hurt? Rock confirmed yes, and that's when Chappelle knew the slap was real. For Chris Rock, the months following were strange. He continued performing stand-up shows around the world, but every audience wanted him to talk about it. But Rock wasn't ready to fully process what happened. That platform came in March 2023 when Netflix gave Rock a live special called Selective Outrage, broadcast from Baltimore. Chris Rock spent the final 15 minutes of Selective Outrage talking about Will Smith without holding back. Rock revealed that Smith had called to apologize, but that the apology felt meaningless because Smith was apologizing for the wrong things. Smith's public apology video came across to Rock as a hostage video where Smith looked forced to say things he didn't believe. Rock pointed out the hypocrisy of Smith trying to protect Jada's feelings when Jada had been publicly hurting Will for years. Rock brought up Jada's Red Table Talk interview where she admitted to having an entanglement with singer August Alsina. Rock said everyone in Hollywood knew about Jada's affair but him. He described Jada as riding Will like a horse, controlling him, making him do things against his nature. Dave Chappelle had his own perspective. Weeks after the Oscar slap, Chappelle was attacked on stage at the Hollywood Bowl. A man named Isaiah Lee rushed the stage and tackled him, carrying a replica gun that was actually a knife. Security subdued Lee, but the attack was frightening. Chris Rock, in the audience that night, immediately ran on stage and grabbed the microphone. He asked, "Was that Will Smith?" And the audience erupted in nervous laughter. The joke broke the tension, but it showed how the Oscar slap had changed things for comedians. People were physically attacking performers on stage, and many blamed Will Smith for normalizing that behavior. Chappelle addressed this in The Dreamer. He said the scariest part wasn't the physical attack, but what it represented. He could no longer tell whether audiences were there to laugh or hurt him. He'd lost the ability to trust the crowd, to feel safe where he was supposed to be most comfortable. And he connected that fear directly back to Will Smith's slap. Chappelle said he didn't know what he would have done if Will Smith had slapped him on stage, but he knew one thing: Smith would not have enjoyed the rest of his evening. Unlike Rock, who sat through the Oscars and watched Smith accept his award, Chappelle would have responded differently. But Chappelle's analysis went deeper. He talked about Will Smith as a human being, not just as a celebrity. Chappelle said Will Smith had been doing an impression of a perfect person for 30 years, and in that moment on the Oscar stage, Will ripped off his mask and showed everyone he was as ugly as the rest of humanity. The slap was Smith finally showing his real face. What Chris Rock and Dave Chappelle were about to expose would explain exactly why that perfect image had been doomed from the very beginning. Keep watching. The marriage. Nobody understood. The slap made no sense without understanding Will Smith's marriage to Jada Pinkett Smith, and that marriage had been confusing people for years. Will and Jada met in 1994 when she auditioned to play his girlfriend on The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. She didn't get the part because at 5 feet tall, producers thought she was too short for the 6'2" Smith, but Smith said he knew their energy would be magic. At the time, Smith was married to his first wife, Sherry Zampino, and they had a son named Trey. Smith split from Zampino in 1995 and immediately pursued Jada. They married on December 31, 1997, and had 2 children, Jaden in 1998 and Willow in 2000. From the outside, they looked like Hollywood royalty. Their children became celebrities in their own right. The Smith family seemed to represent black excellence, wealth and fame, achieved through talent, a tight family unit. But people who paid attention started noticing cracks. In 2013, Jada gave an interview where she said she'd always told Will he could do whatever he wanted as long as he could look at himself in the mirror and be okay with it. The comments immediately sparked rumors that Will and Jada had an open marriage. Both pushed back against the term open marriage, but never fully denied what people were suggesting. Instead, they used language like relationship of transparency and life partnership. In 2018, Will said he and Jada didn't even call themselves married anymore. They referred to each other as life partners, emphasizing there were no deal breakers, nothing either could do that would end their relationship. Will described it as giving each other trust and freedom, that marriage for them couldn't be a prison. Jada said she never believed in conventional marriage because she'd grown up around family members who had unconventional relationships. The carefully worded statements satisfied nobody. Then in June 2020, singer August Alsina gave an interview where he claimed he'd had a romantic relationship with Jada, with Will's blessing. Alsina said he'd sat down with Will, that Will had given him his blessing to be with Jada, and that it wasn't a secret affair but an arrangement Will knew about. The interview caused a media explosion. Everyone wanted to know if Alsina was telling the truth. Jada responded by inviting Will to her Facebook show Red Table Talk for what became one of the most watched episodes ever. Sitting across from each other at the red table, Will and Jada talked about what happened. Jada confirmed she and Alsina had been involved, but she described it as an entanglement that occurred during a period when she and Will were separated. Will looked uncomfortable throughout. At one point, he said he wasn't sure he was ever going to speak to Jada again after what happened. Jada said they'd both been in a bad place, miserable and exhausted with trying to make their marriage work. The Red Table Talk episode raised more questions than it answered. If Will and Jada were separated, why were they still appearing together at events and presenting themselves as a married couple? Will looked hurt, like he'd been blindsided, even though they'd supposedly agreed to see other people. The dynamic was strange. Jada seemed almost clinical, while Will seemed emotional and raw. She kept emphasizing they'd healed, worked through it, were back together and stronger. Will went along with it, but his body language suggested someone still processing pain. Chris Rock watched all of this like everyone else. In selective outrage, Rock said when he made the G.I. Jane joke at the Oscars, he didn't know about the drama between Will and Jada. He didn't know about the entanglement with August Alsina, didn't know they'd been separated, didn't know anything about their marriage. Rock said he'd been busy with his own life and wasn't following celebrity gossip, so when he made a mild joke about Jada's bald head, he had no idea he was touching something so sensitive. Rock argued his joke was actually kind, that comparing Jada to Demi Moore was praising her for looking strong and beautiful. But Will Smith didn't see it as a compliment. Rock said Will Smith was projecting a lot of his own issues onto that joke, that the slap wasn't about the joke at all. It was about everything Will was dealing with in his marriage, all the pain and humiliation he'd been suppressing while trying to maintain the perfect image. Rock revealed that Jada had actually asked him not to host the Oscars the year before, telling him he shouldn't do it because she was boycotting over diversity issues. Rock hosted anyway and made jokes about the boycott, which Jada didn't appreciate. So when Rock showed up to present at the 2022 Oscars, there was already tension. The revelations kept coming even after the slap. In October 2023, Jada published a memoir called Worthy, where she dropped another bombshell. She revealed that she and Will had been secretly separated since 2016, meaning they'd been living apart for 6 years before the Oscar slap happened. They maintained the appearance of a married couple, showing up together at events and posting photos on social media, but they were living in separate homes and leading separate lives. This revelation completely changed the meaning of the Oscar slap. Will Smith had walked onto that stage and slapped Chris Rock to defend a wife he'd been separated from for 6 years. They weren't living together. They weren't in a traditional marriage. They'd both acknowledged having relationships with other people. Yet Will felt compelled to physically assault someone over a joke about her hair. It made the whole thing seem even more bizarre, even more like Will was performing protection rather than actually protecting Jada. Chris Rock was right when he said the slap wasn't about the joke, and the truth about why Will felt he needed to prove anything would reveal an even darker story about what it costs to maintain perfection in Hollywood. The perfect image nobody could maintain. Will Smith started as a teenage rapper from Philadelphia who called himself the Fresh Prince, working with DJ Jazzy Jeff to create clean hip-hop that parents could let their kids listen to. At a time when rap was getting harder and more explicit, Will Smith stayed family-friendly. He rapped about summertime and parents just not understanding, avoiding profanity and violent content. That approach earned him and Jazzy Jeff the first rap Grammy ever awarded, but it also earned him mockery from other rappers who thought he was too soft, too commercial. Smith took the criticism, but kept going, understanding his lane was different. The transition to acting through The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air cemented Smith's crossover appeal. The show ran from 1990 to 1996 and made him a household name across demographics. He played a street-smart kid from Philadelphia sent to live with wealthy relatives in Los Angeles, navigating class differences with humor and heart. The character was likable, funny, occasionally heartfelt, never threatening. White America could watch Will Smith and feel comfortable, while Black America could see someone who represented upward mobility. Smith parlayed that television success into a movie career that made him one of the biggest stars in the world. Bad Boys in 1995, Independence Day in 1996, Men in Black in 1997. Each film was a massive hit, reinforcing Will Smith as the action hero who could save the world with a joke and a smile. Dave Chappelle pointed out during his shows that Will Smith's success story was legitimately impressive. Smith hadn't come from money. He'd grown up in a rough Philadelphia neighborhood, the son of a refrigeration engineer and a school board administrator. His parents separated when he was a teenager. He'd experienced the same struggles that millions of other black kids experienced, but he'd found a way out through talent, hard work, and an almost supernatural ability to read what audiences wanted. Chappelle emphasized that Smith was a dreamer, someone who believed he could achieve impossible things and then achieved them. That's why Chappelle said he saw himself in both Will Smith and Chris Rock. They were all men who dreamed of success and somehow made it happen. But Chappelle also identified the trap that success created. Once you achieve that level of fame and wealth, you become a prisoner of your own image. People expect you to be a certain way, to say certain things, to behave according to the brand you've built. Will Smith couldn't suddenly start making R-rated action movies or gritty dramas where he played complicated, flawed characters. Audiences wanted him to be the hero, the good guy, the person who made them feel optimistic, and Hollywood was happy to keep casting him in those roles because they made billions of dollars. So year after year, decade after decade, Smith kept playing variations of the same character. Charming, heroic, funny, righteous. Even when he tried to stretch in films like Ali or The Pursuit of Happiness or King Richard, he was still playing aspirational figures. The problem was that Will Smith's real life wasn't matching the image. His relationship with his oldest son Trey from his first marriage had been strained for years. His younger kids Jaden and Willow were growing up in the spotlight and developing their own complicated relationships with fame. Smith wrote in his memoir, Will, published in 2021, about panic attacks, insecurity, jealousy, and rage. He described feeling like a coward, like a fraud, like someone performing a role, rather than living an authentic life. Chris Rock saw all of this and recognized it for what it was. In selective outrage, Rock said Will Smith had been performing for so long that he'd forgotten how to be real. For maybe the first time in 30 years of being famous, Will Smith had done something completely unscripted, unplanned, unrehearsed. Dave Chappelle took this observation further. In his shows in Liverpool and London in September 2022, Chappelle said he hoped Will Smith wouldn't put the mask back on. He hoped Smith would let his real face breathe, that he'd stop trying to perform perfection and just be himself. The tragedy, according to Chappelle, was that American celebrity culture doesn't allow for that kind of redemption. We build people up, put them on pedestals, make them into symbols rather than human beings. And when they inevitably fall because no human can maintain perfection forever, we destroy them, we cancel them, mock them, write them off. We don't allow for the possibility that people can be both good and bad, heroic and flawed. Will Smith had given us 3 decades of entertainment and inspiration, but one moment of violence was supposed to erase all of that. Chris Rock wasn't as generous. In selective outrage, Rock said he thought Will Smith was pathetic. Smith had allowed himself to be so controlled by Jada, so emasculated by her public affairs, that he'd become a shell of who he used to be. Rock called Smith Suge Smith, comparing him to Suge Knight, the infamous Death Row Records executive who'd used violence and intimidation throughout his career. Rock said everyone in Hollywood knew Jada had been running over Will for years. He said Jada was driving Will like a car, and Will had completely lost himself trying to make her happy and keep the marriage together. Rock was angrier, more bitter, more willing to attack Will Smith, and especially Jada for their roles. Chappelle was more philosophical, more empathetic, more willing to see the slap as a symptom of larger problems with celebrity culture and the pressure to perform perfection. But both men agreed on one fundamental point. Will Smith had been living a lie, and the Oscar slap was the moment the lie could no longer be sustained. What they would reveal next about how Hollywood enabled that lie would expose a system that protects its biggest stars at any cost. What comedians saw that nobody else did. Chris Rock and Dave Chappelle saw something in the aftermath of the Oscar slap that most people missed. They saw how quickly the narrative shifted, how efficiently the PR machine tried to reframe what happened, and how uncomfortable Hollywood was with the truth about Will Smith's life. Within hours of the slap, publicists and media strategists were crafting explanations. Will had been defending his wife's honor. Jada's alopecia was a serious medical condition that people shouldn't joke about. Chris Rock should have known better than to make fun of someone's appearance, especially a black woman's hair. These narratives weren't wrong exactly, but they were incomplete. They focused on the joke and the slap while avoiding the deeper questions about why Will Smith had reacted so violently, what was really going on in his marriage, and whether his 3 decades of projecting perfection had finally caught up with him. Rock and Chappelle, as comedians and as black men who'd spent decades navigating the entertainment industry, recognized the performance for what it was. They'd both been through their own public controversies and understood how the game worked. When something embarrassing or damaging happens, you get your story straight, you control the narrative, you apologize to the right people, and you hope it blows over quickly. Will Smith was following that playbook perfectly. He apologized to the Academy immediately after winning his Oscar. He posted written apologies on social media. He released that video apology that Rock compared to a hostage video. He resigned from the Academy before they could vote to expel him. He announced he was going to therapy, working on himself, trying to understand why he'd reacted that way. But Chappelle and Rock weren't buying it. Chappelle talked about this during his European tour with Rock in September 2022. He said Will Smith had walked back to his seat after slapping Chris Rock and laughed at other jokes for the rest of the night. That behavior was actually more disturbing than the slap itself. It showed a man who could commit violence and then immediately go back to performing, go back to smiling for the cameras, go back to being the Will Smith everyone expected to see. Chappelle called it gangster, but he also called it scary, because it meant Smith had compartmentalized so completely that he could separate the violent, angry part of himself from the public persona, switching between them like changing masks. This double standard infuriated Rock. He pointed out that if any regular person had walked onto a stage and slapped someone on live television, they'd have been arrested immediately. If a less famous actor had done the same thing, security would have dragged them out, and they'd have spent the night in jail. But Will Smith was too big, too valuable, too important to Hollywood's economy. So the industry protected him, made excuses for him, and allowed him to frame the narrative in a way that minimized his responsibility. Rock called this out as Hollywood hypocrisy, the same industry that claims to care about accountability, but only when it affects people who aren't making them hundreds of millions of dollars. Dave Chappelle connected this to a broader observation about how the entertainment industry treats black excellence. He noted that Will Smith had been held up as a model of black success, someone who'd achieved mainstream acceptance while maintaining connection to his community. Smith was the safe black superstar, the one white audiences loved, the one who crossed over without threatening anyone. But that safety came at a cost. Smith had to constantly perform respectability, constantly prove he wasn't angry or dangerous or difficult. He had to smile when he probably wanted to scream. He had to accept jokes and slights and disrespect because fighting back would confirm every negative stereotype. The Oscar slap was Will Smith finally saying he was done performing, done accepting, done being safe. And the industry's response showed they'd rather have him go back to performing than deal with his authentic anger. Chappelle and Rock both talked about how this dynamic affected them as well. Chappelle had walked away from a $50 million Comedy Central contract in 2005 because the pressure of being Dave Chappelle had become unbearable. He'd disappeared to South Africa, been called crazy, been accused of having a drug problem. Rock had dealt with his own version of this pressure, being the comedian who could talk about race in ways that made white people comfortable. Both men understood the trap Will Smith had fallen into, and both were trying to explain it to an audience that wanted simple answers. What Rock and Chappelle saw that nobody else acknowledged was that the Oscar slap was inevitable. Not that specific moment, not that specific joke, not Chris Rock specifically. But something was going to break Will Smith's carefully maintained image, because that image was unsustainable. You cannot perform perfection for 30 years without cracks appearing. Eventually, the pressure becomes too much, and something explodes. For Will Smith, it exploded on the Oscar stage in front of the world. But Rock and Chappelle argued it could have happened anywhere, anytime, because the real problem wasn't Chris Rock's joke, or Jada's alopecia, or even their complicated marriage. The real problem was that Will Smith had been trying to be superhuman, and superhumans don't exist. He'd been performing masculinity, performing protection, performing devotion to a woman who'd publicly humiliated him through her affair and her revelations about their unconventional marriage. Rock said everyone in Hollywood felt sorry for Will Smith, watching him be emasculated by Jada over and over while pretending everything was fine. The slap was Will's attempt to reclaim some sense of manhood and control, but it backfired because it just made him look more desperate, more trapped in a marriage that was destroying him. That's not all. Keep watching. The truth nobody wanted to hear. Chris Rock, in his most direct comments about the situation, said he refused to be a victim. He told audiences in selective outrage that getting slapped hurt, that it was humiliating and wrong, but that he wasn't going to let it define him or turn him into someone who needed to be protected or pitied. Rock said the victim in the situation was Will Smith, a man so trapped by his image and his marriage that he'd destroyed his own career and reputation, trying to prove something to a wife who'd been disrespecting him for years. Rock said he'd moved on from the slap within days. It was Smith who was stuck with it, who'd have to live with what he'd done for the rest of his life, who'd see it replayed in every interview and article about him until the day he died. Chappelle took a similar but slightly different approach. He said he saw himself in both men because he understood the pressure they were both under. Rock as a comedian making jokes in a culture that increasingly punished comedians for any joke that offended anyone. Smith as a black man trying to navigate success while maintaining his dignity and protecting his family. Chappelle argued that both men had been set up to fail by a system that creates impossible expectations and then destroys people when they can't meet those expectations. He said the real enemy wasn't Will Smith or Chris Rock. It was the celebrity machine that grinds people up and spits them out, that turns human beings into brands and then acts surprised when those brands crack under pressure. The public response to what Rock and Chappelle were saying divided roughly into three camps. Some people agreed completely, recognizing that the comedians were offering a more honest take than most mainstream media coverage. These people appreciated that Rock and Chappelle weren't just condemning Smith, but trying to understand him, trying to explain how a seemingly good person could do something so shocking. Other people thought Rock and Chappelle were being too easy on Smith, that violence is never acceptable regardless of circumstances, and that trying to understand Smith's motivation was just making excuses for assault. A third group thought Rock and Chappelle were using the situation to promote themselves, that their commentary was just another way to get attention and sell tickets. But what all three groups missed was that Rock and Chappelle weren't really talking about Will Smith anymore. They were talking about all of us, about the way we consume celebrity, about what we demand from famous people, and what we're willing to forgive. Chappelle made this explicit during some of his shows, when he talked about how people look at celebrities as big ideas rather than as fellow dreamers trying to navigate impossible situations. He said the problem with cancel culture, with public shaming, with destroying people's careers over mistakes, is that it doesn't allow for the complexity of human beings. It reduces everyone to heroes or villains, innocent or guilty, deserving of support or deserving of destruction. And nobody fits neatly into those categories because real people are messy and contradictory and constantly changing. The truth Rock and Chappelle were trying to tell was uncomfortable because it implicated everyone. It implicated the media for building up Will Smith as a perfect success story, and then tearing him down when he proved to be human. It implicated fans who'd idealized Smith, and then felt betrayed when he disappointed them. It implicated Hollywood for creating an environment where Smith felt he had to maintain a perfect image for 3 decades. It implicated Smith himself for choosing to build that image rather than being authentic from the start. And it implicated Jada Pinkett Smith for her role in creating the toxic dynamic in their marriage, though both comedians were careful about how much they blamed her directly. What made the situation even more complicated was that Will Smith seemed to be trying to rebuild the same perfect image that had failed him. His public apologies, his therapy, his social media posts about personal growth, all of it felt like performance. He was performing remorse, performing accountability, performing the redemption arc that Hollywood and the public wanted to see. But Rock and Chappelle were arguing that this approach would fail again because it was built on the same foundation of inauthenticity that had led to the slap in the first place. Unless Smith was willing to actually be vulnerable, actually be honest, actually show the anger and pain beneath the surface, he'd just be setting himself up for another eventual breakdown. The final question Rock and Chappelle raised was whether we as a culture are ready to handle authentic celebrity. Do we actually want famous people to be real with us, to show their flaws and struggles? Or do we prefer the performance, the carefully managed image, the illusion of perfection, even though we know it's an illusion? Chris Rock and Dave Chappelle exposed this whole damn thing about Will Smith not because they wanted to hurt him or mock him, or join the pile-on of criticism he'd already faced. They did it because they saw themselves in him, saw the trap he'd fallen into, saw how easily any of them could end up in the same situation. What do you think? Did Chris Rock and Dave Chappelle really expose the truth behind Will Smith's public image? Or did they simply say out loud what Hollywood was already trying to hide? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear them. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the following video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.